Welcome to Emotional Resilience, Living with the Fruit of the Spirit. I'm your host and author, Ron Ovitt. You know, up to now, we've been talking about why we behave the way we are. Why do we have the kind of emotions we have? We've been talking about the brain. We spent quite a bit of time talking about how the brain works. And then we spent a couple weeks, couple lessons on attachment, how early childhood can affect the way we think, the way we feel, the way we behave. Now we want to kind of get into some of the emotional regulation. We want to get into maturity and how are we emotion. And so we talk about emotional recognition. We want to recognize where we are. And that's going to take some work. And then we want to be able to regulate it. And then eventually, what is triggering us? What did we learn? What kind of associations did we make that cause us to react emotionally? And we want to know the truth. The truth will set us free. So we emotionally relearn it. We don't just learn it here, we learn it here. And so we're going to be heading down that road for a while. And today we're in lesson 15, and we're going to be talking about striving toward maturity. This is the first part in that. You know, maturity is a natural progression in life. It's where we move from the simple to the more complex. It's a process of growth that we can see in almost every aspect of life. Emotionally, socially, physically, spiritually, our goal is to mature. Now that maturity is interesting, it's a lot of times it's up and down, but as we look at our life, it's up and down, but look where we came from, right? And that's what we want to strive for. We want to strive toward maturity. But often there's roadblocks. When we're younger and children, there's roadblocks sometimes that stunt our maturity. And we call that arrested development. Now, arrested development is a term that's been around for 200 years. Now, most people have probably heard about it because of the TV program. There's a TV program called Arrested Development, and that made the term more popular probably, but it's been around for a long time, and it's talking about where we get stuck at a certain area. Now, you may not be arrested totally in all of your emotions. Some of us can handle fear real well, but we don't know how to handle grief and sadness. It may be that we can handle grief and sadness, but we're not handling anger. So it depends. It depends. Have you ever seen two grown men fight? I mean, they're fighting and they're yelling, they're screaming, putting each other down. Doesn't that look like, two 5-year-olds that fought behind a kindergarten or out on a playground? I mean, we get that way. We revert back to an earlier stage of maturity. And that's what causes a lot of issues in our life. And our goal is, how do we become more mature? How do we become more mature? Now, there's 4 fields of study that have really taken on in this last 20, 30 years. One is attachment theory, which has been around for a while, but we've spent some time on that now. And that's where we talk about our caregivers and how did we relate to them and how that causes us to relate to others in life. And then in our first lesson, we talked about the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, the survey that they did and they continue to do. And we talked about that seminal study and how that adverse childhood experiences really cause us to be stunted emotionally, physically, and otherwise. And then there's that adult children of alcoholics. There's a whole group out there, and that can of course apply to other addictions, but being raised in an environment where there's that incoherence, right? That inconsistency and that chaos that comes from someone being addicted can really cause an effect on the children. And so there's a whole group out there that meet together as adults of children of addictions, you might say. And then, of course, there's a post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which has become more and more popular since the 70s. And then that's a study where we know that people have issues due to trauma. Now there's post-traumatic stress that can happen after a single incident, right? You get in a car accident and it really shakes you up. You don't want to drive on the expressway anymore. You're afraid to get in the car. You were mugged, right? And you're afraid to go outside the house. I mean, those things happen. And that's post-traumatic stress. And you know, the good news is we know enough about that we can help people. You know, in 8 to 10 sessions sometimes or whatever, we can help people overcome that. But then there's another kind, and that is the complex PTSD, and that's where we had continual stress, right? We had that continual trauma, and that causes a lot of turmoil in the development of children, and even young people and adults, you know, people that go to war, right? And they've been in war for a while, it gets really complex there. And in their book, the Complex PTSD Workbook, the authors say this. They say trauma often arises out of the interactions that occur in the first years of life. Sometimes the trauma begins within the first months of being born. Such early childhood memories are not like typical memories that occur later in life. You may not have images or a clear story. Instead, you might experience emotions without understanding why, or even physical sensations of unknown origin. Growing up afraid has ramifications on all aspects of development. And we call that a fear bond, right? It affects us cognitively, emotionally, and physically. The cost of childhood trauma can persist into adulthood until you find sufficient support to heal your past, and that's the good news, right? The most common experiences included in the notes. I have a whole list here, and I encourage you, please go through the notes and prepare yourself for the discussion questions. So if you meet in a group, you can go over that. But it takes sometimes, you know, you need to underline and read. The people that get the most out of this are the ones that call me and said, you know, I'm really studying the notes. I'm underlining, I'm circling, I'm really trying to learn this stuff. That's how we learn anything, right? It takes repetition, it takes focus and concentration. I encourage you to do that. It will make a difference in your life. But what are some of the things that happen then as a result of this childhood trauma? Well, cognitive distortions, right? Inaccurate beliefs about ourselves, others, the world, God, right? We've been talking about that, and we want to be able to correct that. And then there's emotional distress, right? Feelings of being overwhelmed, anxiety and helplessness, hopelessness, despair, deep loneliness, all these things. When you have these overwhelming emotions and you don't know where they're coming from, then it's probably from childhood trauma. Now, that doesn't mean there's no hope. They already said it, and I agree with them that we can be healed from this, okay? That's the good news. But you can't be healed from something you don't want to acknowledge, that you don't look at. And so it's important that we see this. Acceptance that we have some of these things is the first step. We don't have to be afraid that we have some issues, okay? Another one is disturbing body sensations, right? I mean, I learned, you know, I had irritable bowel, right? And I thought it was common. It was my norm. I didn't really think about it. But headaches, backaches, neck aches, a lot of these physical things can happen as a result of trauma. You know, it's not an accident that 85%, some say more, some say a little less, of the doctor visits don't have physical issues. They're really emotionally, or, you know, we could call plasticity of the brain, that are causing the body to react in certain ways. And then there's disorientation, right? The inaccurate beliefs and emotions, body sensations all contribute to a loss of distinction between past and the present. We can get disoriented. Hypervigilance, that's one I had. I was always like going to a room and like, oh boy, I better watch out how I behave. What am I going to say? I better be careful. It's like a predator in a room. And that humming was always on, and that kind of hypervigilance. Then avoidance, right? Social anxiety, not wanting to go places, avoiding certain things that are uncomfortable. Interpersonal problems, brain development, health problems. And I got a whole list here. And the goal is to look at these and say, yeah, I think I have some of that. And it's not a foregone conclusion that you have to stay that way at all. Instead, that's what we want to work on. But if you don't know what you're going to work on, how can we work on it? That'd be like driving your car, it's clanging, smoke's coming out of the back, it's sputtering along, and you're like Mr. Magoo. You're just driving down the road ignoring all of it, right? No, get the car fixed. Well, likewise, we want to work on these things, right? Other symptoms would be feeling of irritability, self-harm, eating disorders, social anxieties, and outbursts of anger, suicidal ideations, addictions. Those are more severe. And listen, if you're working on that, you have that issue, let's work together, okay? In this class, get some counseling, let's work on these things. Why? Because there is hope. There is hope today. You don't have to go through this alone. There's hope. We want to grow into maturity. We want to grow into maturity. The goal of maturity is to go from a very dependent baby into a full-grown adult, right? We usually think, though, of going from dependent, and especially here in America, to independent, the great independent person, right? But that's not maturity. We're not meant to be totally independent. Rather, we want to be an adult that lives in a community with others, and we want inner dependence, right? We need each other. We grow into maturity through relationships. We didn't grow into maturity in a dysfunctional relationship. We learned things about ourselves that were negative, that aren't true, from dysfunctional relationships. That we made associations. The way we get out of that is having people that love us, people that are happy to be with us, people that we share with. That causes what? New associations, new beliefs, right? And new inner feelings. And so that's how I went from feeling unlovable to being to a place where I feel that I am lovable through my wife and others that have cared for me over my adulthood. Well, what are some of our maturity needs? And this is the part of the lesson where you're going to have to go through. I can't do it here via video. You need to spend the time to look at these things, to check them off, to see where you are. And we'll have quite a few of these in some of our lessons, these inventories, if you will, so we can know where we are. We can plot a plan of how to go forward, okay? And so you'll see that some of the maturity needs, and I'd want you to rate where you are to, not having, I don't experience this, or it's very true for me. And so we have safe and secure with those I trust and love. Love is constant, unconditional, and always there no matter what. Where do I feel about that? Yeah, it's really true for me, or it's not true for me. I'm loved, special, valued, unique. How do I really feel about that? And so there's a whole bunch of them. I can return to peace and joy from painful emotions. These are the kind of needs that we have. And are they being fulfilled? I belong and am connected to others in a special way. I'm loved for who I am without having to perform. And so you can go through those and check them off. The trouble is, we don't want to look at them sometimes, and so we don't get to help. But there's nothing to fear here. Nothing to fear. We're not diagnosing. This isn't a diagnosis to where there's no hope. We're trying to see, where do we need to improve, okay? Where do we need to improve? And a lot of times it's hard to improve in our emotions because we have this negativity bias, right? It's we get used to having the negative. We learn hopelessness, right? Helplessness, and we want to give up sometimes because we have this negative spirit. There's no use. We maybe don't think that, but we certainly act it out sometimes. And that negativity bias, where we start looking for the bad things and all that was a way to keep us alive sometimes. I mean, if you're walking through the woods, you got to watch the roots, right? That you don't trip. You got to watch the cliffs that you don't fall over. You certainly want to be aware if there's any dangerous animals, But that negativity bias keeps us in the emotional funk, if you will, all the time. And we need to learn to be more positive. We need to know that there's hope today. and we need to look at the good things. And one way we improve in these emotional problems is as we start to make progress, we need to register it. Remember, these are habitual ways that we've behaved. And so we're starting to feel positive. We have a good day, and then boom, we wake up the next day and it's a bad day. And boom, it's another one. And we forget that we had some good experiences here. And that negativity bias keeps us going in a negative. And what Richard Hansen had, he came up with an acronym HEAL, and he said, H, have a positive experience in truth, right? Have a positive experience. You experience some positive things emotionally, and then he says, notice it. And then E, enrich the positive experience through duration, intensity, novelty, personal relevance. Otherwise, notice it. Be happy about it. Wow, that was great, And then A, absorb the experience or truth about yourself. You finally believe that, hey, maybe I'm lovable because you had a great experience with someone. Revisit that emotionally. Feel again what that felt like. Hear that again. See the look on the person's face. Visualize it again. Let it sink in. The truth is, good things that happen to us filter right through the brain if we're not purposeful in trying to remember them. We have a negativity bias, and we need to work on remembering these good things, because that's how we make new associations, right? That's like scripture, right? We can read it, but it's that repetition and reading it, thinking it, seeing that God is saying it to us. That's how it gets from here to here. And then L is link the positive and negative experience so the brain can sense it. Otherwise say, yeah, I felt this way, I felt unlovable, but boy, I sure felt lovable here, right? And it's like geometry. You try to make something true. If you can find one way that negates it, boom, it's out. And that's the thing. You have a certain belief about yourself that's negative. If you have a positive experience, shouldn't that start discounting it? And that's what we want to do. Well, I also have a list of some maturity traits that you can go over, okay? Traits like handling my emotions, very mature or immaturely. Fulfilling my responsibilities, am I kind of immature or mature? Where am I on that continuum? Living with relationships, being healthily assertive, saying no to unhealthy boundaries, being intimidated by others, handling pressure to please people, delaying gratification. Those are all things that we need to mature in. Where are you? That snapshot in time right now, where are you? Those are the things that we want to start improving on. Those are the things that cause us to be more mature. And then you'll see in your notes too, I have a whole list of immature negative beliefs. These negative beliefs. And a lot of times you can ask yourself, well, gee, I wonder what negative beliefs I have. And I don't know, I can't think of any. Well, here's a whole list. I have a whole bunch of them here that you can look at. And here again, don't do what I used to do. Think shame of yourself if you have any of these. Try to ignore it. If I was in this class and this came up like that, my heart would have been beating. I would think that I'm going to be judged. I wouldn't want to admit any of these things. But you know what? I'm glad I'm at a different place now. That's where we can grow. And no one's here to hurt you. This is not a definition of who you are. It's where we are. And the good news is you are lovable. You are significant, right? You have a purpose. And all those good things are already true about you. We just need to get to a place where we really start to grasp it. And so others must approve of me or else I'm bad. I must please others to be liked. I've been a people pleaser. I know that one. I must get permission from others. I must hide my mistakes. Be brutally honest with yourself on these. Look at these things and, make it a prayer. Lord, help me with some of these, and write them down or check them off, circle them. Say, Lord, I give these things to you. Help me be conscious of them. Help me start to improve in these areas, right? We want to mature. And, if we summarized all those, you'll see that we have, about 10 different kinds of symptoms, if you will. Fear of failure, need to please others, inordinate or false guilt, feelings of being broken and shameful, a fear of God, feeling inferior to other adults, fear of abandonment and rejection, anxiety, fear of expressing myself, and being over competitive. Those are some of the things that are coming from those underlying beliefs. So you want to look at that. And it may be that you should start, somewhat with these key symptoms and then go back and look at some of the beliefs and start challenging them. What does God feel about that? What does he believe? And this will be great in order for us to mature. And then they can also result in negative or immature behavior and attitudes. So, I gave you a little list there. Where am I when it comes to being judgmental? How about defensive, passive-aggressive, standoffish or withdrawn, right? Self-absorbed, right or wrong, black or white thinking, clingy, being dependent, right? You can look at some of those and ask yourself, where am I? Now, you could also ask someone that knows you and loves you, say, where do you think I am on some of these? Now, that's a bold step, I know. But you know what? You have nothing to fear. I mean, they already know it about you. Wouldn't it be great if they had an opinion that was somewhat that you needed work on, that you would acknowledge it, be vulnerable, and say, hey, I'm going to work on this, help me. Isn't that a wonderful thing? You make it a prayer to talk to God, but you also have others. You enlist others to help you. And then I have a whole list of some of the characteristics, attributes of maturity. And I, what's love look like? What's mature love? What's immature love? And you can rate yourself on that. And then emotions. Where am I with my emotions? And how about responsibilities? And what about a win-win attitude or resilience or stress? And so I define what's a mature and what's an immature. And you can look at those. And here again, this is for the rest of the course, right? We want to look at these things where we can say, Lord, help me. I have it on relationships as well. And here's the good news. This is a process. It's a process. And we know that these things become coded in our brain and they become ways that we behave and think. But here's the good news. It can change. It can change. We can recode these things. Coded reactions can be changed as we have loving, caring, mature people around us. And so that's what we're trying to do. That's why I encourage you to be in a group. Now, you may be watching this by yourself, and that's okay, but it really would help if you were in a group. And then finally, as you study this lesson, you'll see that I talk about being more mature. And I give an example here as we look at expectations. I have 3 circles of expectations here, and you'll see that normally if we're immature, we have an expectation, and when it's not met, we get disillusioned, right? And then we get discouraged, and then there's doubt comes in, and then there's helplessness and despair, and that only causes what? More expectations of negativity, and a lot of us live that way. A lot of us have this circle of negativity. But if we're going to be mature, there's an expectation. And yes, there comes disillusionment, right? We get disillusioned. But then there comes a time when there's acceptance. There's an acceptance. It happened. And then we wait. In, that grieving process, if you will. And then we adapt. We are adaptive creatures. And then we move on. We move on from there. But, acceptance is real important. And you can see I wrote a little bit about acceptance from AA. You can read that in the lesson. And acceptance is a key principle of a lot of the negative things that happen in our life. But it can be even different, even better when we bring God into the picture. When we bring the Lord into the picture, we have the ability to mature with Him. And so you have an expectation. And yes, something comes along and we get disillusioned. But what does the Bible exemplify for us? Laments. where they would lament over this, and they would tell God how they feel. Lord, where are you? What's going on? But if you read the lament, you always see that it ends up with God is faithful or God is good. They go through this emotional process. And so there's the expectation, a lament, and then there's a surrender to Him. It's a surrendering to Him. Not, that's more than just acceptance. It's bringing Him in. We're making, there's a whole philosophy out there called sense of coherence. And how do we make a sense of coherence out of some of these things? Well, God is the great coherence factor. When we bring Him in and we tell Him how we feel, we lament, we surrender to Him and allow Him to work in our life. And then we wait on the Lord. We wait on the Lord. And what's He do? He renews our mind. That's what Paul was talking about. He talked about all the suffering they were going through, but he says, yet the Lord renewed our mind day by day. And that's what happens. We come back to Him. The Lord assures us of His love, of His presence. And we can make a coherent story out of it, knowing that we're trusting in Him. And then you'll see at the end of this lesson, I have a whole list of different maturity habits. Here again, start to look at this. Now, maybe you thought this class was just going to be a little bit of book reading and me lecturing, and we'll just learn a bunch of stuff. Well, we're in the hard part now. We're in the part where we want to change, right? And if nothing happens, nothing happens. And if we don't know what to change, nothing's going to change. And so be encouraged. We're human, all right? We have these things. Don't sit here and try to be that superhuman, that it's a sin to have immature habits. No, it's a sin not to change them, right? It's a sin not to acknowledge them. There's no shame here, okay? This isn't shame. This is about being mature. And if we were arrested in our development, then guess what? Take the handcuffs off, right? We don't need to be arrested anymore. We can go ahead and look at some of these. I have a healthy love of self. I didn't. I decided to work on that, right? I return to peace and joy from anxiety. I'm not. Lord, help me. How am I going to do that? Because that's the goal of this class. We want to be emotionally resilient. And it's going to happen as we become aware of these things. We commit them to God. We get relationships that will help us grow. And you'll be amazed. I've seen it over and over and over again, how people come and they spend it. Now, that's why we're a year-long class, because it takes time to do this, repetition and time. But I tell you what, you stay with it and you will change. God will work in your heart and life. We will become more mature. That's our hope, that's our prayer, and it can be our reality. So I look forward to being with you in the next lesson when we continue on this maturity, striving toward maturity, part 2.